applaud yet. You haven't heard my presentation. Thanks for showing up on this beautiful spring day. In the world of things could be worse, does anyone remember what happened 43 years ago today? Anyone who's old enough?
Snow. Full of snow on my motorcycle seat.
Yeah. 43 years ago today, we had 12 inches of snow. I remember I was a third grader growing up in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. You're a third grader? Good for you. School was closed, so I was playing outside with my friend, and it was snowing to beat all get out. And all of a sudden, the sky lit up, and there was this big clap of thunder. And that's the reason I remember this day, was because that was my first introduction to thunder snow. So a weather geek like myself remembers stuff like that. Well, about 2 years ago to the day, I was standing right here in this room talking to some of you about the surveys that we had done on the lower middle Sugar River watershed and parts of the upper lower Sugar River watershed. And subsequent to that, in 2014, so later on in 2014, we did a couple of other studies that are related to this part of the state. The first was this, we continued our surveys of the lower part of the lower Sugar River watershed, as well as a study of the main stem of the Sugar River, which I'll talk about first here. So this is about a 50-mile stretch between Lake Belleville and the Illinois border. They don't allow me to go into Illinois, sorry, otherwise I could go even further. And we selected 8 different sites along the main stem of the Sugar River. And this was a comprehensive study of the main stem that was kind of surprising to me, had never been done before. No one had ever gone along the main stem of the Sugar River and done various sites along the river. Now, this was not a comprehensive study of the entire Sugar River system. In other words, we didn't go and do backwater systems. We didn't do oxbows. We didn't do things like that. So it's not a compendium of the Sugar River system, but it is a study of the main stem. And it's a little bit difficult because, especially above Albany Lake, there are vast portions of the Sugar River that are what we could call wadeable. That is, you and I can go out there, put on a pair of waders and wade them. But there's also long stretches that are non-wadeable. And in particular, once we get then down below Decatur Lake, there's many longer stretches of non-wadeable river. And so we decided the best way to do this whole thing comprehensively was to use a mini boom shocker. Now, those of you who are familiar with electrofishing, we basically have a generator and an anode and a cathode, and we put electricity in the water. The fish are shocked, they come up, we net them, we count them, we don't kill them, and we return them to the water. So this is just a bigger version of, some of you might have seen us doing a little backpack shocker or a little streamboat shocker. This is just a bigger version of that puts more electricity into the water. And we found that was the best way to sample the main stem. So what did we find? Well, we found a plethora of red horse, which are, a lot of people mistake them for carp. They actually are not carp. They're in a different family. They're in the sucker family rather than the minnow family like carps. They're actually a good indicator. They're a good water quality indicator because they like to spawn on hard substrate. This little fellow is called the northern hogsucker. Again, another good indicator species. They're what's called intolerant. That means they don't like their habitat to be all messy and things like that. They like a fairly good habitat. Quillback, again, another member of the sucker family. And bigmouth buffalo. We see a lot of people, again, mistake these with carp. They are not. They're actually a much better eating version of carp. I shouldn't say version of carp because they're not carp. But we found a lot of these. These made up a great deal of the biomass of the Sugar River. And again, good water quality. We also found a great abundance of game fish. Some very, very nice smallmouth bass. So those of you who are interested in an angling adventure on the Sugar River, you won't be disappointed. For all of the game fish, we took measurements and we took weights on all of those fish. And as we proceeded downstream, we found the diversity of species increased. Now, this is because of a couple of factors. One, the presence of the dams, of course. We have the dam at Decatur, we have the dam at Albany. That does preclude fish movement upstream from those systems, unless we have very high flow systems, and then you have the flow working against it. So it's not surprising that we saw a greater diversity of species downstream. The other is the size of the river increased. And so you get certain fish species that don't show up until you have a minimum size of a system. And so those two factors led us to finding a greater diversity of species downstream of Decatur Lake. Some of the things that we found downstream were very nice specimens of smallmouth bass, channel catfish, which are in the upper right corner, very, very plentiful. We found a great deal of northern pike and walleye. Some of those walleye were probably run-ups from the Pecatonica River system and the Greater Rock River system. But also because years ago we did a great deal of planting of walleyes into Decatur Lake, and so those may be part of that population. We also found a couple of beautiful specimens of flathead catfish, which are a little bit different than channel catfish. They have a little different look to them, and they're also piscivorous, meaning they are fish-eating, as opposed to channel catfish, which will eat just about anything. We also found our usual suspects downstream of Decatur Lake. We found the golden and silver red horse. We found gizzard shad, again, a species that tends to like larger river systems. You see these a lot in the Mississippi River and the Wisconsin River. Again, larger river systems. We found bowfin, or dogfish, as a lot of people like to call them. Very cool fish. When they're in their breeding colors, they tend to get a real green body and a big eye spot at the back of their tail. Very good fighter if anyone's ever caught one angling. We also found freshwater drum, which a lot of people call sheep's head. Again, a large river species. And we also found this feller, which is a river red horse, which is on the state's list of threatened species. So again, another indicator of the situation out in the Sugar River. When we talk about the Sugar River and its quality, one of the things we have to look at is the landscape through which it flows. Now, as we all know, the Sugar River flows through a highly agricultural watershed of southern Dane County and Greene County. One of the things that really helps the Sugar River is the fact that it has a very broad floodplain. And therefore, that kind of acts as a de facto buffer to the river. A lot of times you can't farm right up to the edges of the river because certain times of the year, your crops are going to be underwater. So the Sugar River has a very nice natural corridor for much of its length. It has wood. And wood is very important because in a lot of these systems, when they get wide and they get shallow, wood is the main habitat that these fish use and relate to. It helps create scour holes. It helps create places to hide. And so where we see wood, we like to say wood is good. And I know a lot of people are interested in the paddle sports and making a nice corridor to go through. That's okay. We like that too. But one of the things that we would advise against is the let's clear the channel, let's clear it from side to side sort of thing, okay? Clear enough channels so that you can get your canoes and kayaks and things like that through, your tubes, when people go tubing and things like that. But leave the stuff that's, along the edges because that's what the fish tend to relate to. So there's, again, another Another great picture of the type of area where if we would go by that with the shocker, that's where we would tend to see most of our fish. There were some areas along the Sugar River that where we did see some steeper eroding banks. A couple of those areas were north of Broadhead here. And those, in certain areas, those were augmented or stabilized with riprap. And I gotta say, fish love riprap too. They're a great area for colonization of bugs and things like that. And so the fish really like them. So what did our study show us, for the most part, related to the fishery of the Sugar River? Well, all of our, this is starting at Highway 92, so upstream to downstream at Nelson Road, down in Nelson Bottoms. Each of the individual metrics of native species and intolerant species, etc., all add up to this score down here at the bottom. And as you can see by the rating scale, the fishery of the Sugar River is showing us that we have a fairly healthy system here. And based on the fish that we saw, and in comparison to other sites that I've done, such as the Pecatonica, I can tell you that indeed the Sugar River mainstem, despite all the perturbations, despite all the issues that we do have from point and non-point source pollution, urbanization, things like that, the Sugar River is doing fairly well from a fishery standpoint. I think one of the things it does is cement our designation as an exceptional resource water, because I can tell you not all river systems in this part of the state, in southern Wisconsin, in the agricultural watersheds, are in as good a shape as the Sugar River.
Rock River.
Not entirely.
Not entirely.
Not entirely, no. So anyway, that was the Sugar River mainstem that we did in 2014. In 2013, we had done that area in yellow up there, which again was the lower Middle Sugar and parts of the lower Sugar River watershed. Some of the things that we found from there is, I'm sure when a lot of you think of some of the streams in this part of the state, you think of these fairly straight, fairly shallow systems that tend to have a lot of sediment in them, and that does tend to be the case. We do have a couple of sites that are worth mentioning. One is Sylvester Creek. It happens to be one of the few trout streams down in this part of the state. And indeed, we found a decent population of brown trout in Sylvester Creek. Interestingly enough, we found more trout in the area that was not designated trout stream than we did in the area that was designated trout stream, but nobody told the trout where they were supposed to be, and so I'm certainly not going to tell them where they're supposed to be. But as we look for areas of focus where we can maybe look to do some work in the future, Sylvester Creek holds some promise. We also have Searles Creek. Now, Searles Creek is its neighbor just to the north. The water temperatures of Searles Creek are fairly similar to that of Sylvester Creek in that they tend to be on the cold side. But the morphology or of the systems is a little bit different. You have less of a gradient in Searles Creek. I think that tends to increase the residence time of water in that system. And as such, we see a lot more manifestation of the nutrients in that system in the form of filamentous algae and macrophytes. So Searles Creek is on the state's 303D list of impaired waters, and based on our survey of the habitat and things like that, I would say that is probably deservedly so. So those are two of the standout systems, I guess, from that 2013 survey. The 2014 survey, we looked at the areas in blue here, those on the east side, such as Swan Creek, Taylor Creek, and Willow Creek, and then those over on the west side, OK Creek, Spring Creek, and Oakley Branch. So we we took a look at those systems, and those of you who live in the area are probably not surprised. This is a fairly typical picture of the streams on the west side of the Sugar River. So this happens to be Spring Creek down at Mount Hope Road. Fairly entrenched, very steep banks, and very shallow with a lot of sediment in them. And a lot of them tend to run through wooded corridors that have these steep banks and have a lot of fallen trees into them. Again, another shot of a system that's fairly wide, fairly shallow, and again, flowing through a wooded corridor. In contrast to some of the streams over on the east side of the Sugar River flowing in from Rock County, these tend to have more wetland complexes, again, like we were talking about with the Sugar River, and as such, they tend to be able to get out to their floodplain a lot easier. They don't have these steep banks, and they don't tend to have agriculture as close to the stream as the ones that we see on the west side. That's not to say that's a universal fact for the whole system. Some of the upper systems have agriculture very close to them, but the closer we get to the Sugar River, the more of a buffer we have. So what did we find there? Very interestingly, we found a great array of darters. Darters are a warm water species that, as the name suggests, they dart from site to site because they have no swim bladder. So most fish use their swim bladder to kind of control their buoyancy in the water column. Darters don't have that. So as such, they kind of sit on the bottom and they kind of dart from place to place. Again, a good indicator of good water quality. They generally are not found in places that do not have good water quality. A couple of the different species we found was, this is the Iowa darter. Very cool little fish. They're very patriotic because they have a little red, white, and blue dorsal fin here. What was interesting about the survey in 2014 was that in the past I had been used to finding Iowa darters in like 1 or 2 or 3 individuals. In 2014 in the Willow and Taylor Creek systems, I found them by the dozens. And I talked to one of our fisheries researchers and I said, have you ever seen a population like this? And he said, no, he'd never seen that. There's really no explanation as to why we saw this many of them other than conditions all came together and they had a really good year or two. And, you know, that's kind of the way Mother Nature is. You know, things come together and every year weather-wise is good for some things and bad for others. No matter what the weather is, it's going to be good or bad, depending upon what species you are. These little guys happen to have some really good years, so we saw a lot of them, and that's a good thing. I think they tend to hang out in the Sugar River in low numbers, and then when conditions are right, boom, they take off. Banded darter, again, another beautiful species. We found these throughout the system. The black side darter, this is one of our bigger darters. They get to be, 5, maybe 6 inches long. Tend to relate to wood a lot. Found in the system. And then my favorite, which is I know this picture actually doesn't do it justice, but the rainbow darter. I know when I was a kid and I was looking through fish books and I used to think, oh man, I wonder where you got to go. What tropical place do you have to go to see fish that look like this? Oh, right here in Greene County. We also took a look at the bug community because they are an indicator of ecosystem health. This is a good-looking guy from many years ago. He's obviously been, this must have been when Hansis supervised me. I still had dark hair and looked good. The bug community really reflected, I think, what we see from a land use standpoint in this part of the state. Let's start with the column over here on the right, the HBI, the Hilsenhoff Biotic Index. That measures how much organic material is coming into the system. Actually, we're doing pretty good, okay? We don't have a lot of organic material, a lot of poop, for instance. We don't have a lot of things like that coming directly into the system. There was one site down here that I got to tell you was basically a site that was through a wetland. There almost was no bottom in this system, so it was very organic, enriched material. So it really wasn't a reflection of something coming into the system, but rather of the type of system it was itself. The left-hand column here is the MIBI, the Macroinvertebrate Index of Biotic Integrity. And that kind of tells us a little bit more about what's coming into the system, what the area right next to the stream and just upstream from that particular site looks like. And as you can see, we had some goods, but a lot of fares. And I think that is a very good representation of these sites in the lower Sugar River. There's some good things about them. There's some, we have some good habitats, we have some good riffles, but we also have some issues with the riparian corridor, with the inputs to these systems. As we all know, with a lot of tile drainage going on in these systems, some non-point source runoff, things like that. So I think the bugs kind of really reflected what's going on in the system fairly well. And thanks to you guys, we have a lot of phosphorus data for these systems. Because of your volunteer monitoring efforts, we have one of the more robust phosphorus databases anywhere other than maybe the Yahara River watershed. And something that was kind of interesting to me, that kind of jumped out to me, was that if you look at the dots from 2013 to 2015, they're kind of going up a little bit. And so that's kind of interesting to me. It's like, why would that be happening? I could see if we had a specific weather year or something like that, where we had a lot of rain, particularly a lot of rain or a lot of events, that we would see increases in phosphorus. We did see a decrease in Taylor Creek. Taylor Creek went down the 3 years we've been monitoring, but for the most part they went up. So I was kind of curious as to, was that just related to the lower Sugar River lower Sugar River watershed itself, or was this part of a more regional trend? And so we have a long-term trend monitoring station about a mile that way on the Sugar River over at Tenneck Road. And so we have a long-term data set for that, dating back to the 1960s. And so what I did is I plotted the mean growing season phosphorus concentration, the median growing season phosphorus concentration for the Sugar River at Tenneck Road for the last 3 years. And you can see, indeed, the Sugar River itself saw that same general increase, okay? I'm not saying any of this is statistically significant, because there's a lot of variability in there, but just an overall trend in that median going upwards. But if I looked at the 10-year trend for the Sugar River at Tenneck Road, you can see it's actually a slight downward trend. So I think in reality, this is probably more of a static, uneven state, because I think the high water years of 2008 are kind of where we had the flooding and we had a great deal of rain and things like that. I think they're kind of pushing this end of the line up a little bit, but overall, and certainly what we've seen since the 1960s and the 1970s, is that phosphorus levels have dropped considerably in all of our systems since the late 60s and early 70s, since the implementation of the Clean Water Act. What we're seeing now is that overall phosphorus levels have kind of leveled off. Okay, we're not seeing any big decreases. So what is great about you guys is that you're going to continue to monitor these tributaries to the Sugar River down here in the lower Sugar River watershed. And so we're going to be able to see what, does that trend continue? Or are we going to see it kind of go back to a more steady state, which is what we would anticipate? So how do we determine then the overall state of our systems? Well, we put together the full picture. We look at the fish community, we look at the habitat, we look at the water chemistry, and we look at the bugs, and we determine whether or not a system is meeting its attainable use or whether it's impaired. So these systems in bright red are the ones that are currently on the 303D list. We have the main stem of the Sugar River, which is on the 303D list because of phosphorus exceeding our criteria of 0.1 milligrams per liter. You may be saying, well, but Jim, you just told us the fishery was really good. And it is. The fishery is really good. Fish tend to relate more to habitat than they do phosphorus concentration. Unless it's really a severely perturbed system with very, very high phosphorus, the fish almost always relate more to the habitat than they do the phosphorus. So we exceed the criteria, and we do have the phosphorus criteria now, so we have to put those on the 303D list. Those ones in sort of a brownish color are the ones that we're proposing to add for the 2016 list, the list that's going to go out this year, because of the work we did the last several years. We have Riley School Branch, which is a tributary of Judah Branch. Riley School, we found very poor habitat there, as well as very little in the way of biotic community. So the biotic community there was impaired as well. Judah Branch, even though the fishery was okay, there's a lot of areas of steep banks, very shallow, a lot of sediment. So we were going to put that one on for habitat impairment. OK Creek, that one also is going to go on because of habitat impairment, as well as phosphorus that exceeds our stream criteria of 0.075. OK Creek is kind of an interesting one to me because the phosphorus concentrations in it are almost twice the criteria, almost at the level that you would see if you had some sort of point source in it, which we don't have. So that's one that bears a further look. We're also proposing to add Swan Creek to the list because of phosphorus criteria. Now that one does have a discharge on it from Orfordville. So that one really doesn't surprise me all that much. And then we also are going to add the side channel here for the Sugar River that runs past Broadhead here. That one too is just sort of making it consistent with what we have for the Sugar River. I mean, the water chemistry of that is really no different than it is for the Sugar River, so it's just for a consistency standpoint. Real quickly here, I'm running out of time and I don't want to cut into Mark's time or lunch too much. What can we do now? We have these issues, what can we do? Well, we talked about the steep banks. This is a lot of what some of you are seeing going on in the watershed right now. Some of it is in the drainage district parts, some of it is in the non-drainage district parts, where a lot of landowners are clearing the trees off of their banks and sloping the banks back. And I know for a number of folks that's kind of disturbing because it really changes the view shed of the landscape quite a bit. But I can tell you that this is one step toward improving the habitat and the sediment in these streams. By taking out these trees and sloping the banks back and allowing the vegetation to reestablish itself, we are taking away a major component of sediment input into these systems. This was taken this past fall by Susan, and then this was taken in December by me, and you could see how the grasses are kind of all in place, and so when we get high flows in the spring, these banks are not going to be vulnerable to erosion. And so it's actually a first step in improving these. The other thing I want you to notice is, see how nice Susan lines up her horizon? Parallel with the slide, as opposed to.
You gotta get out of the car to get it.
Just a little bit, yeah. The water's not flowing this way, it's flowing that way. So it is one step. And again, because of our studies that we've done on other sites, we know that bank contributes 30 or more % of the sediment load to these systems. So it's one tool that we have to use to address the sediment load. The other is doing work up in the watershed itself, which I'm sure we'll talk about more in our discussions as we go on with the rest of the day. The other is that it provides a way for landowners to maintain this. It's an easier way of doing it through either mowing or burning and things like that. So it's a lot easier to maintain. I am a little concerned about the loss of some of the habitat in these streams, i.e. the woody stuff. When we do our permitting process, we are requiring landowners to keep the wood that's in the stream, so that they don't touch that. I'm not saying it happens all the time, but at least the wood that's in there, we're encouraging them to leave it. The other thing that we have going for us is that a lot of these systems in this part of the state originally evolved from prairie landscape. They didn't originally have a lot of wood along their banks and things like that. So this is a project site that we did up in southern Dane County, and it's my vision that someday, by stabilizing these banks and things like that, we can have systems that look like this, which they're deeper. They continue to create point bars and things like that, which narrow up the stream. We have stable banks. We can work with the agricultural community on harvestable buffers and things like that, so that we have healthy systems down here too. And so my time, I'm going to be around the rest of today, so I could certainly take questions. But in the interest of moving us along and getting us to lunch, I think we'll just go with Mark. How's that sound?